Hi there, I'm Melissa Faith Hart, the CEO and founder of eBodyGuard, and I'm here today with former District Attorney George Brauchler, and we're very blessed to be able to have a candid discussion with him about his career and his experience. And thank you for joining us today, George.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about quite a few things. We're going to segment this interview. First, talk about your career and the cases that you were prosecuting. I think that many people know the cases that you've prosecuted, as well as the history of our work together. And then we're going to end this interview with your work at eBodyGuard. And so, is
Awesome.
that during
a song? I understand we'll be ending
this. You're going to sing?
Oh, no, I thought you were. You are the person that writes the musicals. I'm just the person that attends them.
I see. So you're not singing today?
I could hum along. Depends on what the tune is.
I see. Okay. Well, now that we are, letting the audience know that you are singing and I am not singing, we can start this conversation on the right foot. So without further ado, why did you want to become a prosecutor?
I didn't.
What do you mean you didn't want to become a prosecutor?
I had no interest in even being an attorney. I mean, that goes way back. By the time I was a senior at the University of Colorado, Boulder, go Buffs, I was on the path to becoming an armor officer, active duty armor officer in the United States Army. That's what I wanted to do. Drive around, blow stuff up, fight for freedom, that kind of thing.
Like every other guy. Just want to blow things up. You didn't want to throw up.
Listen, unlike the infantry guys, I wanted to go to war. I just didn't want to have to walk to get there. So I felt like armor was probably the best combination of those things. But a long story, but one thing led to another. And finally, my mom, who was a huge influence on my life, and she passed away back in 1998.
Sorry.
Two things about my mom. One, she had been one of the chief investigators for the Office for Civil Rights at the federal level here in Denver the whole time I was growing up. And that probably unwittingly, put in my head the idea that I just despise bullies. And I hated the people that took advantage of those who were innocent, weak, or incapable of necessarily protecting themselves. That was always there. And then my mom in her 40s with 3 kids at home and a full-time working husband decided to go to law school, went to the University of Denver College of Law and became an attorney. And so those things probably combined to lead me down a path where I ended up taking the LSAT, which is that law school prep exam, and then ultimately applying for law school. And instead of going active duty armor, I took an educational delay, went to law school, did the JAG Corps thing, and started working at the Jeffco DA's office, Jefferson County DA's office, where I grew up. And that just kind of led to a whole bunch of other things, whether it was Columbine or Kobe, leaving the DA's office, not once, but twice, and finding my way back to running for DA here.
So that leads me to my next question. The district attorney job. I believe that now we're going to get to some of the segments. The world of being a district attorney, and you were the district attorney of the 18th Judicial District when I know I met you before that, but there's individuals that believe a district attorney has a certain job. And then when you became the district attorney, what is the actual job of the district attorney? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, look, at its core, a district attorney is charged with no less than doing justice. As big or as small as that word is, that's the job of the district attorney. And the way that they accomplish justice is by applying the law to a certain set of facts and uniquely applying it to individuals. Part of it is you want to make sure that you treat similarly situated people similarly. But that also means you got to treat ones that aren't similarly situated differently. And the backdrop of all that is the idea of public safety. And, so a DA is not defined by all the convictions they rack up or how many years they get people sent to prison. There are individual cases that garner attention from the public and that, make movies and stuff. And that's how people see prosecutors. But at their core, whether you're the elected DA or you just are a county court, a misdemeanor level deputy with your own docket,
Mhm.
Your job is, on a day in, day out basis, is to do justice by the community, by the victims of cases, and by the system.
And so I'm going to take you back into that last part or the former part of what I brought up. What did you learn people may believe a district attorney's job is?
Well, I think a lot of people just perceive that the district attorney is the dark, brooding individual that you meet in court who's there to try to extract a pound of flesh for every transgression of the law that there is. That's true in some cases, but that's not the bulk of cases. I mean, the vast majority, in terms of number of cases that a DA's office handles,
Mhm.
are not by bad people. They're by people who have made a mistake, maybe even a repeated mistake. It's neighbors who've gotten a DUI,
Mhm.
or a relationship that spun out of control and resulted in some horrible decision making that left someone hurt. Or sometimes it's people stealing when they don't think that they're going to get caught. These are people that I think find themselves in the system mostly on a one-time basis, mostly. But where it becomes a little more challenging and a little more serious is when you have the more serious conduct, when somebody is brutalizing another person, repeatedly victimizing them, whether it's a domestic violence victim, a child, it could be a neighborhood, it could be people in a movie theater or a school. And the level of charge is reflective of how horrible that crime is. So, it's one thing to slap another person. It's obviously another thing if you stab them or shoot them. And so as you work your way up into a much narrower, smaller pool of cases, you begin to deal with issues that are much more serious, and they're not as easy to resolve. Those cases, those limited number of cases, that's how the public views the prosecutor in their everyday job, that's all they do. That's just not true. There are many cases that we resolve without ever sending people to prison.
For instance,
Go ahead.
Tell me about
Yeah,
those.
so for instance, you might have a drunk driver that comes in.
Mhm.
Even on a second offense, do they pose a risk to the community? Yes. Does there need to be consequences? Do there need to be consequences? Yeah, there do need to be consequences. But it's far cry from someone who is abusive to their loved one, a spouse, a girlfriend, their partner, whatever, in a way that leaves them broken. Could be broken bones, orbital bone, could be permanent scarring. It could be some sort of, and even though this isn't prosecutable, it's something that comes out of these cases, this idea of emotional terrorism in a way.
Mhm.
And these children that get impacted by this. And so those cases get resolved differently than the lower level ones. Even property crimes, burglary is super serious, and we treat it super seriously. But burglary, by definition, is a property crime. That's at a certain level. But when you punch someone in the face and break their nose or their eye, or you kidnap them, or you sexually assault them, that is completely different. You can get over a stolen car much more quickly than you can get over the stolen innocence or the stolen autonomy that takes place with some of these crimes. So that, I'd say if we prosecuted 35,000 cases in a year when I was DA in the 18th, the vast majority of them were traffic, low-level misdemeanors, even higher-level misdemeanors. We probably prosecuted out of that group 5,000, 5,200 felonies. And not all the felonies are created equal either, right? Like certain identity theft, possession of financial transaction devices, certain drug charges. Those are serious, don't get me wrong. Not the same kind of serious as violent crime, a different kind of serious.
So I'm going to transition you to talking about one of your most challenging cases. I mean, it sounds like you've had a variety of cases that you've tried throughout your career. We're going to talk about, your famous cases in a bit. I I want you to open up just for a little bit and tell us about the most difficult moment or the most difficult or challenging case that you've had and why.
Um, it would just be too tortured for me to try to come up with a smaller, less known case that was more difficult to prosecute. I can't look, the Aurora Theater massacre in many ways represented a unique case for this community and a turning point in the way that we view mass shooting cases and the way they're handled by the media nationally. And for me, it was logistically challenging. The volume of tragedy and misery that were generated over such a short period of time in that one movie theater are epic, and they're quantifiable only in terms of numbers of bodies. We had 12 deceased, 70 attempt murder victims. We could have charged hundreds more attempt murder victims, but instead we limited it to just those who are actually shot or hit with shrapnel or injured in the theater. And that volume
can I interrupt you for a second on that one? How did, knowing that you had to do that, what about the other ones how did you support the other ones that you weren't able to?
That's a really brilliant question. So when we went through our statute and the Constitution, Colorado has a pretty robust victims' rights amendment. We identified, I think it was over 1,258 victims potentially.
Oh, wow.
Now, even though we only charged the 12 deceased victims for the 12 deceased and then the 70 others, we treated everybody that qualified under the Constitution as a victim for the purposes of having access to all of our victim advocates and all of the other services we provided, victims compensation, courtroom. They were all brought in equally.
Okay,
but
good.
For purposes of charging, because if we hadn't done that, I mean, we would have had hundreds and hundreds of charges. I mean, just the two theaters that bullets went into, Theater 9 and 8, each held 400 people. That would be 800 victims just for that. I mean, we identified, I mean, just the apartment complex the guy tried to blow up was another 100+ victims. We had the family members of the survivors, like the survivors, family members of the deceased. That was like 112 people. I mean, it adds up quickly, and there's diminishing returns to that. We wanted to take care of them like victims, but to formally bring them into the case would have made prosecution almost impossible. Just
you
the
might
trial
still
would
be
have been double.
prosecuted.
Oh my God, we could still be in trial. It's just so onerous. So there's that, and the little pieces of the case that hung out with me the most and still haunt me are really, one of the victims is 6-year-old Veronica Mosier Sullivan. And she was killed in that theater with her then pregnant mother and a couple other kids from the neighborhood that had been kind of babysitting her that day while mom was at the OBs getting the thumbs up on the first trimester of that unborn baby. She was there with her significant other. And telling the story of that, not just in opening, but in the courtroom, I did the direct examination of Ashley Mosier, who was the mother, and having her recount what happens and having to ask her questions that may seem trite, but they're absolutely essential. And yet they felt so damn difficult to get through. I'll give you an example. And folks should know this, Ashley was shot and paralyzed and collapsed on top of her daughter who'd been shot 4 times. And I'm asking these questions while she's in her wheelchair, wheeled up to our little 3D image of the model of the theater. And I'm having to stand there, ask her in front of the jury things like, could you feel your daughter breathing? And she says, no. And I said, could you feel your daughter moving? And she says, no. And I said, well, what'd you do? She said, well, I just had to lay there on top of her until the police and the fire folks came and picked her up and carried her away. She'd been a quadriplegic for a long time. She regained the use of most of the use of her arms. She had a miscarriage. The relationship falls apart. And overnight, she goes from a single mom of a 6-year-old, how she'd been defined since high school, on her way towards happiness to, I don't know. That was the hardest part of that case for me.
Sounds like it's still with you.
Oh yeah, that doesn't go away.
Yeah. So I realize that you are the prosecutor and the district attorney, but you are known nationally, if not internationally, for being one of the greatest trial attorneys of our time.
Oh, I don't know about that.
You will, and you're clearly humble about that. But
I like it when you say it, though, honestly. It could be a ringtone. If I could just, every time you called, if it said, you are one of the greatest attorneys.
you have clearly been able to support, look at difficult moments, and you weren't done, or you weren't finished after Aurora Theater. You had already prosecuted the Columbine shooting. You had then you moved on to the STEM school shooting. Is there anything that you want to share with us about anything you learned about the STEM school shooting that you think is important for us to know about that shooting in particular?
Interesting about STEM was that, and I have had, whether it's the fortune or misfortune, depending upon how you view this, of being associated with and handling some big cases, some of which had a ton of victims. And there's always stories that come out about acts of heroism. And I got to tell you, most of those stories end up not being accurate. And part of it is because the media loves to tell a story about a hero. They love to tell a story about something good that took place in these things. And there are those things that exist, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But when you get to the point of looking at STEM, and for those who don't know that case, you should Google it. Kendrick Castillo was the young man who really saved the day. You cannot overstate how many lives he saved in trading his own for everyone else in that room. He stood up and charged the gunman with the gunman's words, "Nobody effing move," right out there as he was indexing the crowd, the classroom in 107 with his firearm, and Kendrick just charged him and ended up taking a lethal round, but provided enough time and delay for the other two kids, Brendan Biley and Josh Jones, to hop up and run and crush this guy too. And by the way, across the classroom, another gunman shooting at the students, and a student and a teacher took them down. But Kendrick Castillo was really the first to go through that. And, he's the miracle baby, the only son of John and Maria Castillo. Like, they didn't think they were going to have kids, and they ended up having him later in life. And that's its own tragedy. But you cannot overstate how heroic his conduct was and how it was such a game changer for others. But that brings me to this other point. Having handled these big cases, you get exposed in this job to the worst of humanity, the worst decision-making that humanity can go through. But in each of these cases, there are those moments and those individuals who show you the best of what humanity can be, something great about humanity. And, I don't think that anybody goes to school or work or a movie theater or a supermarket. I mean, as we talk right now, the mass murder of 10 up at a King Soopers in Boulder, that trial's set to start this week, right? Just nobody thinks that this will be the moment that my life is in jeopardy or it'll be tested.
No.
So you never know what your mettle is until you're there. And, in classroom 107 there at STEM, there were at least 5 people that really saved the day. Something inside of them, something about their upbringing, they found a way to be strong in the face of not just evil, but potential death in a way that, listen, I'm deployed to war. I've gone to Iraq. I can't tell you what I would do in that situation, but these 4 students and a teacher, they did it. And makes me feel good about humanity to think that people can dig deep and find the strength to do the right thing.
And they found their brave in that moment.
They sure did. They sure did.
Yeah, to lose your only son
Oh boy.
But
Yeah.
in reality, that was the highest call, and then saved so many people. So many
Well,
people.
I think we can go through life wondering, why am I here?
Mhm,
What's my role in being here? What's that thing that I'm supposed to do here?
mhm,
And I know this sounds horrible, but
mhm.
for John and Maria Castillo, they got that answer for Kendrick, and that was Kendrick was there to save lives.
Wow,
Amazing.
big statement. Big
Yeah.
statement. Um, moving to our work that we have accomplished and our purpose of working together. So back to the Aurora Theater shooting,
Yeah.
and back to you get into office, and even before you actually took office, the shooting had happened, and so you were, I mean, you were busy right away. And then I walk in and I say, "Hey, I got an
Yeah.
idea. I got an idea," and you didn't even say no.
Yeah.
It's like
Well,
you said yes.
yeah, but well, in part because it was an idea that had solved for us, if it could work,
Mhm,
something that had been plaguing our criminal justice system for a while. And that was, how do you reliably,
mhm,
predictably,
mhm,
consistently
mhm,
provide discovery? And for folks that are watching this that aren't in the criminal justice system, discovery is this: when the prosecution charges a member of the community with a crime, it's their obligation under a whole bunch of things, including a rule of evidence that's real, or a rule of procedure that's actually premised on a part of the Constitution that says, hey, the government's got to give you all the information that they're going to use to prosecute you, and they got to give you stuff that even exculpates you, that makes you look like you're not guilty. They got to do that. That's the only fair way to do this, and I agree with that. That had been challenging because before you walked in the office, we still had detectives driving from any one of the 23 law enforcement agencies we had in the jurisdiction, getting in a car, bringing over a box of paper, maybe a DVD or a CD, and driving into the DA's office, scheduling time to meet with a prosecutor. And then we had to manage, how do we transfer that to a medium where we can get it to the defense attorneys and all that stuff.
Do you remember what I said to you that day? When I
No,
said,
I'm sure it was poignant though.
I said, "Why do you do this? It's crazy."
Yeah, well, and I think the answer was, we didn't have a better answer. There was no better answer. And you said, hey, what if we did something super cool, like make it all digital from the dashboard of the police officer's car all the way into your office, the courtroom, the public defenders, and we provide this way to audit it, make sure that, you know, when someone says, hey, I didn't get something, we can look it up and go, oh, yes, you did, or no, you're right, you know, you didn't get it.
Mhm.
And I thought to myself, thank God, because you know, it had plagued the system to the point where courts were starting to issue orders penalizing the prosecution for failing to get certain information to the public defenders, not because we're hiding it, but because it was just mismanaged, or we hadn't received it yet, or something. And so cases with victims were being impacted by the fact that we hadn't figured this system out. And so when you talked about the possibility of something called e-discovery, and I think part of it was a discussion with me, part of it was a discussion with the big statewide district attorneys council, and they said, all right, we need someone to want to be like the pilot project for this thing. And I said, oh, hell yeah, I want to do this. One, most challenging jurisdiction in the state. We were the largest in the state by a ton. 1.1 million people covering 4
Right.
diverse counties that went everything from, you know, 20,000 acre ranches to Aurora, right? And everything in between. I said, if we can make it work here, we can make it work anywhere. And so I volunteered, said, let's do this thing. And that turned out to be true. So,
But what happened as we struggled? What did we do?
well, there's a couple things. One, even though there was interest in moving down this road, because everyone loves a good idea,
Mhm,
at some point, as you start the real process of changing the system,
mhm,
there's going to be institutional pushback. And some of it is from people who are invested in the way we do things now. Some of it is, and every organization has this. You just have that person as the human dark cloud that goes into every meeting and says, no, we can't. No, we can't. You have some of that. And some of it was legitimate technical issues like, okay, how do we overcome this? How do we address this? So those were all things that took place.
And what did we do to solve it?
We quit. No, we didn't. We never quit. We never quit. There would be things that would come up. People would be in my ear saying, hey, this isn't going to work. We shouldn't do this. And I said, tell me about it. And to the extent that my little DA brain could understand the technical hurdles and stuff, I just said, I just want you to keep moving forward. There's got to be a way to figure this out. There's got to be a way to, and over time, we didn't just implement it in the 18th, it got bigger than that. And we ended up having a statewide committee that I was thankful to be appointed to as the representative for the large offices. And we had medium offices and small offices and all these other stakeholders. And I think what we found over time is once it started to prove itself, we built up a certain momentum that really allowed us to work through the other problems much more quickly. It stopped being, no, we can't because, and it became much more of, okay, here's a problem, but here's how I think we can get past it, or here's how I think we can get over it or around it or something like that.
And that's what anything takes, right?
I think so. I mean,
quitting, solving the problems together, just keep showing up, right?
Like I can't imagine the very first prototype for the iPhone was like flawless, right? Like this was a device that has changed the world, right? And I can't imagine in 2006, the year before it launched, there wasn't somebody out there. In fact, this is funny. You may have seen this when it launched in 2007, after they'd done all their testing and the bugs and all that other stuff. There was somebody, and I cannot remember where I saw this because it resurfaced recently, where they said, horrible idea, way too busy. They said people want to use their phone for some calendar items, some text and phone calls, and that's it.
You said that about the iPhone?
Yeah, said this thing is a huge dud. And it's like, nailed it. But that's the kind of voice that's out there anytime you try to say we can, and I think the term they use for these is like disruptor, right? Like whether it's Uber or any of these other things, you always get those voices of, no, there's no way, there's no chance.
I remember when Uber came to our cities, I would always have these taxis say, what do you think? Do you think that it'll actually work?
Oh boy.
And I had like the cities sitting with me and saying, oh, well, they're not following our policies. And I'm like, I have a feeling that they're going to be okay. And here we all get Ubers, right?
Well, and yes, and it hasn't been that Uber has been flawless. They've had their own issues to deal with, but Uber begets Lyft, which begets some of these other things. And all of a sudden we're taking ideas like Uber and going, what about Uber Eats? What about DoorDash? Like, what are these other things we can do to solve problems that we didn't even view as problems? We just viewed it as, well, that's the status quo. That's how it's got to work, right? And now things like that begin to pick up momentum. But you have to have that first sort of redefinition of what we're capable of before you can see what the other potentials are.
Which brings me to my next question. Why did you start your journey here at eBodyGuard?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had sat down and talked about this much earlier than the lunch that we had, where I ultimately was like, all right, let's do this. And it sounded like a great concept, sounded like a great idea. And I thought, man, this is so early in the process. I just can't see how this thing is going to play out yet. And I had some other things going on. But then when we got back together sometime after that, you had pushed it down the field quite a ways. And it was now at a place where it was like, listen, I have some things I need to hear from law enforcement about to make this thing more meaningful. And what would a prosecutor want if this thing is going to be usable and valuable? And how do I do this? And so it's probably a combination of things. One is the mission is something I truly believe in. We're trying to prevent as many victims as we can, but for those that are out there, we're trying to empower them to be in a position where they can, I guess, different decisions potentially about how to address whatever they've gone through as survivors. I also think that there's a level of accountability that this helps prosecutors and law enforcement get that we're just missing right now. I mean, everybody has heard the phrase, he said, she said. That's real. That's a real limitation on a lot of cases that we have. And I think what eBodyGuard attempts to do is to say, maybe it's not he said, she said. Maybe it's he said, she said, and so did the video and the audio and the other evidence and information that we've been able to accumulate and stuff like that. And I think that that's hugely helpful. And really at its core, I think that people in today's world make a lot of decisions out of fear, and those decisions tend to be self-limiting. And I'm a freedom guy, and that's what I love about America. We're a freedom people, right? If you're afraid to leave a relationship, if you're afraid to walk to your car at night, if you're afraid to go to a certain part of town, then are you as free as you could be or should be? When you start limiting the decisions that you make out of fear of the consequences, is that freedom? And so at its core, I think eBodyGuard is about enhancing freedom for individuals. That's what I think.
Well, that's an empowering message.
Oh yeah, it's true.
Very empowering. And so our mission is that we are the bridge to smart, safe cities. And that helps people really, it keeps them safe wherever they are. So what does that in particularly mean to you?
Well, like I said, I think it begins with the idea that people who have never been victimized to begin with have a conception about what it means to be victimized and what they would do in those situations. Okay, we call 911, right? Like everybody thinks, well, I'll just call 911 and law enforcement will show up and they'll take care of it. That's true. I mean, I love the men and women in law enforcement. That's true. But many times they're limited too by their response times, by their resources, by how much information they have when they show up to a scene. And some of the decisions that they end up making, if they're imperfect, are the product of imperfect information that's available to them. How did they decide who's the initial aggressor? How did they decide whether this is a one-off versus a pattern of conduct? How did they decide if there's enough evidence there to at least achieve the probable cause necessary to make an arrest in a domestic violence case or to protect a victim through the system? So that's tough. This will allow people to feel more empowered. Like, I know that when I use eBodyGuard, whether it's a word or the swipe of a finger through the technology piece, that I am going to be more accurately helped and probably more quickly helped by law enforcement than if I just did the same old 911 call. I think the other thing that eBodyGuard offers is an opportunity for victims in relationships who are not yet strong enough to leave. And that's real, folks. I mean, you may know someone that's in a relationship where you're like, why does she stay with him? Or why does he stay in that relationship? And what you can't know are the dynamics and the power struggle that exists and how someone feels internally. And so it's hard to go from horrible relationship to I leave and it's over. That's hard. And I think eBodyGuard isn't just the bridge between that person and resources that can help them, but in many ways it's the bridge between fear and just enough empowerment that they're willing to make a different decision too. And whether it's because they can put important information they'd like to save for law enforcement or the courts or whatever up in a place they know it'll be safe and never be tampered with or deleted or altered, or whether it's the ability to know that they can capture some horrible moment in a way that will be preserved so that the good guys, when they show up, know the right thing to do. I think that provides that bridge between those individuals and I think not just the system, but a greater sense of autonomy and strength.
You know, that's interesting what you just articulated, because I know I had an interview with Rita Smith where we talked about why doesn't she just leave, right? And the fact that a victim can capture this information, and for the first time in a victim's journey in their cycle of abuse, they know for a fact that they have the evidence that if they can present this to the DA, if they can present this to law enforcement, they know that it's not just their voice,
Right.
that now they actually have this. You're articulating this so well, because what you really just said back to me is this becomes almost like their police in their pocket, or their extra layer of, and you said it's going to cut the divide of the he said she said, and it's great. It's that bridge that they need, and really an innovation that's never ever been introduced to the market before. I mean, it's hitting me for the first time how you articulated that.
Well, well, this is legitimately the big difference maker for
Right.
how we interact with each other, is if we knew that there was always the option to
Right.
trigger something that would call for help, but also capture the moment and provide a different layer of accountability, we might be different with each other. We might be better towards each other.
We might be more civil. We might
be more
actually
civil.
consider what we say to each other and how we treat each other and respect each other. And that was my hope, right, when I innovated it. But I didn't take it to that next salient level, which is that, that is exactly what we need, so that victims are going to know, I now have this piece. I
Yep.
truly do have this piece. So, and speaking of that, what excites you about our partnership announcement that's about to come out with the National Domestic Violence Hotline and eBodyGuard?
Well, listen, you could have the best product with the best mission and the best tagline
Mhm,
on the planet Earth,
mhm,
but its value is diminished if it's just something that exists and isn't used. And so having won over, if that's the right term,
mhm.
the National Domestic Violence Hotline, for them to see the value and say, you know what, we think this is the kind of thing we want to make available to the many, many people out there who are stakeholders with us, that support us, that support victims out there. I think that's when you get the game changers, right? So having the eBodyGuard platform and this great service and products, yes, that's neat. But what will really make it exciting is when we have more of these stories out there of how things actually didn't happen because of eBodyGuard, or when they did happen, that the bad person ended up being held accountable. I mean, the more of those stories we get, the more you look around and say, okay, we're making a difference. And maybe that's the answer I should have led with, is what excites you about it? The chance to make a difference, the chance to minimize bad things that happen to people, and the opportunity to hold some people accountable for the bad things they do to innocent people. I mean, as a prosecutor, as a dad of a daughter and 3 boys, that's what I'm looking forward to. That's what excites me.
So is there anything else, with all of the things that you've learned throughout your career, that you want to share with our viewers that you think is so critical for them to know?
Yeah, my experience with
Mhm,
victims has been that each one is unique. Now, there are some trends that you can see. There are some things you might be able to predict in certain situations, and there are dynamics that exist that are consistent with many victims.
mhm,
But at the end of the day, a victim's journey to get from what happened to them or the relationship they were in to that place of empowerment where they're able and willing to leave, they're able and willing to participate in the process that will hold that other person accountable. Those are myriad. I mean, they're unique. You can't predict what that thing is. Do they do it for themselves? Do they do it for their kids? Do they do it because they don't want some future victim out there? Is it all of those things in some ratio? I don't know, but everybody is unique in this. But what eBodyGuard does is provide each of those victims an opportunity, once they have sort of figured out what their motivation is, to feel more empowered and stronger about taking that step, regardless of who they're doing it for, to feel better about taking that step. And from the prosecutor standpoint, what I like is we lose victims in cases. Well, I mean, we lose victims. You might have someone who at first has every good intention in the world. They call 911 because they're afraid. They want that immediate help. They want to protect themselves and their kids. And at some point during this very arduous process through the criminal justice system, they drop out because all the pressure in the world is on them.
It's hard.
eBodyGuard provides an opportunity to take a lot of that pressure off of them. And I think that will keep more of them engaged moving through the process. And I think that that's better for them as well.
I want to personally thank you. I want to just from my journey with you for the last 15 years, I've learned a lot from you.
I appreciate that.
Personally, thank you for what you've shared here in this interview. I know that the other viewers that are going to watch this are going to learn from you here today, and for your service.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for your time today.
Of course. And by the way, for people that are out there looking at this, you should know initially we thought this thing might go 70 or 75 minutes. So you're welcome. You are welcome.
And with that, we will call it a wrap for the Smart Safe Cities My Bodyguard program with expert George Brauchler.